Please subscribe and share for more story. The heavy pounding against the front door did not sound like a dream. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting solid wood at 3:15 in the morning, and it forced Lydia Monroe, age 67, to sit upright in her dark bedroom. The silk sheets on her bed felt cold and foreign, like she was lying under a funeral covering instead of linens she once shared with her late husband for almost 4 decades. Her heart raced so fast she felt lightheaded, and her hand shook as she reached for the nightstand. Instead of finding her phone, she knocked over a glass of water. The shattering sound on the hard floor made her flinch. For weeks, Lydia had felt something building, a strange fear that someone close to her would eventually come for what they believed belonged to them. But she never pictured it becoming this real. She didn't need the security cameras to know who was outside. She already knew. Still, she pushed herself out of bed, her knees cracking as she stood. She moved toward the window and pulled back one side of the thick curtain. Outside, she saw wet pavement, streetlights, and 2 figures she wished were strangers, but were not. Standing in the drizzle was Lydia's daughter, Marissa, her face twisted by anger. Next to her stood Carter, Marissa's husband, a man Lydia had never trusted. Carter swung a hammer into the new high-security bolts Lydia installed only days earlier. The metal rang with each hit. Marissa screamed something, but the sound was muted by the glass. Lydia closed her eyes. "She used to be a child who clung to me during thunderstorms," she whispered to herself. Now that child was threatening to break into her home. Lydia pressed a hand to the window pane and listened to the next shout. "Mom, open this door before we break the windows," Marissa yelled, her voice cold and impatient. Lydia stepped back into the hall. She didn't turn on the lights. She knew every floorboard in that house. She and her late husband had built it from nothing. She remembered buying lumber when they barely had enough money for food. Now their daughter wanted to force her out of it. The pounding continued, loud, steady, confident. Lydia inhaled slowly, letting calm settle over her because panic would not help her now. As Lydia stood in the foyer, the soft glow of a lamp flickered inside the study. Helen Moore, Lydia's oldest friend, stepped out carrying a phone and a tablet. Helen was 68, sharp-minded, and calm even in chaos. "Lydia," she whispered, "are you absolutely sure you want to do this tonight?" Lydia turned toward Helen, her voice steady. "They chose this moment the day they started lying about my health." Helen nodded. "I'm ready to call the officers and the witnesses." Lydia exhaled. She kept thinking of her husband, Frank, and how he spent weekends building this home with his worn-out hands. She wished he were alive to see how wrong Marissa had become. Lydia closed her eyes, repeating her decision silently. She would not give in. She would not be bullied. She had lived too long, worked too hard, to let her daughter and a greedy son-in-law claim she was mentally unfit. The hammering stopped. A new voice replaced it, Carter's voice, low and sharp. "We know you're inside, Lydia," he yelled. "We have the papers. We have the doctor's assessment. You can't live alone anymore, and we're not leaving until we secure this property for your own protection." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Threatening her with a weapon as protection?" she murmured. Lydia almost laughed. She thought about the rumors they tried spreading, that she was losing memory, misplacing things, hearing imaginary sounds. It was all design. They wanted control. But Carter underestimated her. Lydia was the woman who started a tailoring business from nothing and built a small empire with just determination. She whispered, "I survived poverty, Helen. I survived losing Frank. I can survive my own daughter's greed." To understand her strength, Lydia remembered her childhood. She grew up in a working-class steel town where her father labored long hours until his back gave out. Her mother scrubbed floors in rich homes. Lydia became the caregiver for her siblings at age 10. She learned to mend clothes because new fabric was too expensive. She remembered sewing under the yellow light of a kerosene lamp. At 16, Lydia worked in a loud textile mill for tiny pay. Those struggles shaped her. And in that same mill, she met Frank, a young carpenter with rough hands but a kind smile. He used to wait for her after shifts, dust in his hair, a flower in his pocket. "We'll build a better life," he would promise. They didn't have fancy dates, but they had shared plans, shared drive. They married in a courthouse and bought nothing new. Their first home was a tiny apartment where winter wind entered through the windows. But they saved every dollar. Every penny meant hope. Years later, they finally managed to buy land in Harbor Point, where they planned to build something no one could take away. Lydia thought about the early years on that land. Frank spent every weekend clearing rocks and cutting brush with nothing but cheap tools and determination. Lydia carried water, lumber, and crates of nails while their baby, Marissa, slept in a homemade sling on her back. Together, they built the foundation by hand. They mixed cement in buckets, laid stones for a fireplace, and etched their initials into the mortar, where only they would ever know. When the house was finished, it wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. Their daughter learned to walk in that living room. She learned to read sitting on Frank's shoulders. Lydia remembered Marissa racing down the staircase and collapsing into Frank's arms after nightmares. "Daddy, don't let the monsters in." Frank would laugh and say, "There are no monsters here. We built this house too strong." Lydia swallowed hard at that memory, because now the monster was not fear, it was greed. Marissa once promised she would never abandon her parents. She once said, "You gave me everything." But somewhere along the way, that gratitude curdled into entitlement. Everything began to shift after Frank died. He passed away quietly one sunny morning while trimming the rose bushes he planted for their anniversary. Lydia found him beside the flowers, eyes closed, peaceful. Losing him felt like losing the roof over her own heart. She spent weeks moving through silence. When Marissa returned home at age 34, carrying disappointment from a failed interior design career and a failing marriage, Lydia welcomed her. She wanted warmth in the house again. She didn't mind when Marissa and Carter stayed without paying rent. She didn't complain when Carter began treating the home as his personal office. She only wanted company. But slowly, Marissa's attitude changed. She began complaining about the size of the house. Too big for a woman your age. She criticized Lydia's routines. "You forget things now." Carter whispered about getting professional help. Lydia didn't understand the hints at first. But looking back, she knew they weren't caring for her. They were preparing to replace her. At first, the manipulation was subtle. Lydia misplaced her keys. Marissa insisted she left them in the wrong place. Carter mentioned conversations Lydia never remembered having. They claimed she repeated questions. Lydia began doubting herself. Then one night, she heard them speaking sharply in the dining room. She had gone for warm milk and froze when she heard Carter say, "We need her to sign power of attorney before the end of the year." Lydia stopped breathing. Carter continued, "That land is worth 3 times what she thinks. If she has a stroke, the courts interfere. We cannot wait." Marissa whispered back, "But she's stubborn. She thinks this house is still Dad's memory." Then Marissa asked, "Did you talk to Dr. Avery?" Carter chuckled. "For a few thousand, he'll diagnose anything. We just need proof she's declining." Lydia felt as if her bones turned to ice. She realized they weren't planning support, they were planning confinement. She didn't confront them. Instead, she retreated into silence because she knew a storm was coming, and she needed evidence. The next evening, Lydia waited until Marissa and Carter went out for dinner. Then she entered Carter's private study, a room that once belonged to Frank. She searched through drawers and found a thick folder. Inside were drafts of guardianship documents, brochures for luxury care facilities, and a spreadsheet listing every one of Lydia's assets. She stared at the page mapping out her life, savings, property values, bank accounts, as if she were a business target. The worst page listed prices for private investigators to track her activity. Lydia photographed every document with steady hands. That night, she called Helen. "They want to put me away," Lydia said. Helen answered calmly, "Then we build a wall of truth." Quietly. Over the next weeks, Lydia submitted herself to full medical evaluations at a different city hospital. She passed every cognitive test. Helen helped set up a trust requiring co-signatures and updated Lydia's will, leaving nothing for Carter. Then came the final step: surveillance. Hidden cameras recorded every smirk, every scheme, every belittling comment. Lydia waited patiently. She would not be fooled again. 3 weeks later, Lydia invited Marissa and Carter for breakfast. Sunlight filled the dining room. Lydia served coffee calmly and said, "I'm selling part of the land to a conservation group. After that, you both need to move out." Carter dropped his fork. "You can't do that," he snapped. He stood, towering over Lydia. "This house belongs to the family. You're not fit to decide anything." Marissa leaned forward, pretending to be gentle. "Mom, we're just worried. You're being influenced by people who don't care about you." Lydia sipped her coffee. "I am fine. And you have 1 week to leave." Carter's mask cracked. "You stubborn old woman, I'm warning you." Helen stood in the doorway, silent, watching. Marissa hissed, "We'll talk about this later." They stormed out. Lydia locked the doors that afternoon and called a locksmith. She expected anger. She expected protests. But she did not expect a hammer. Not at 3 in the morning. She stood now in her dark foyer, remembering Carter's final words that day, "You won't be able to stop us." He was wrong. Back in the present, the pounding continued until Lydia motioned to Helen. Helen stepped aside, revealing 2 officers and a court-appointed observer hidden in the dining room. Lydia unlocked the door just as Carter swung forward, nearly losing balance. He looked up and saw uniforms. Marissa froze. Lydia spoke plainly. "Good morning, Carter." "Marissa, were you looking for me?" Carter tried hiding the hammer. Marissa began crying immediately. "Thank God you're here," she told the officers. "My mother is being controlled by this woman." She pointed at Helen. "She's unstable. We tried to help." Helen raised a recorder. "We have 45 minutes of your threats," she said calmly, "including breaking every window." The observer inspected Carter's documents. "This case number is fake," she said with disgust. "This is fraud." Carter's skin drained of color. The officers stepped forward. Marissa whispered coldly, "You've ruined my life." Lydia looked at her daughter with slow, honest sadness. "No, Marissa," she replied. "I didn't ruin you. I just stopped you from stealing what you didn't earn." Marissa trembled, eyes full of fury. Carter stared at the floor. The officers escorted them outside. Lydia stood in the doorway watching. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like farewell. That night, Lydia sat alone near the fire, thinking about what a mother is supposed to do. "Did I push too hard?" she whispered. She remembered Marissa as a toddler hugging her legs. She remembered braiding her hair before school. Grief washed over her. But Lydia also understood something painful. You cannot build character for someone else. You cannot love a grown adult into honesty. Marissa had chosen the fast road, the greedy road. Lydia could not pay for that with her freedom. She looked around the house, the stones Frank placed, the beams he cut, the roses outside, and she knew she had defended more than property. She defended dignity. The legal aftermath unfolded slowly but steadily. Within weeks, Carter was facing charges, attempted fraud, falsified documents, and attempted forced entry. Investigators also began looking into his business deals, and Lydia heard through Helen that several clients had already come forward with complaints. Marissa avoided all contact. She packed what she wanted from Lydia's home and vanished into another city where her reputation meant nothing. Lydia did not chase her. She did not beg. "Love doesn't mean surrender," Lydia whispered to herself while trimming roses in the garden Frank once cared for. Every thorn prick reminded her that beauty needs protection. She returned to her sewing room, not because she needed money, but because creating helped her breathe. She stitched bright fabrics and donated dresses to local girls' groups. "Your hands still have purpose," Helen told her one afternoon. Lydia smiled faintly. She did not feel triumphant. She felt bruised inside. "I lost my daughter," she said quietly. Helen shook her head. "No, you lost her years ago. Tonight only made it clear." Months passed. Seasons shifted. Lydia found a rhythm again. She supported herself. She cleaned rooms. She cooked. She slept without fear. Most importantly, she decided to do something meaningful with her skill. Together with Helen, she started a foundation for young women, teaching them tailoring and basic fashion design. She remembered nights by the kerosene lamp, wishing someone would teach her more. Now, she could give that gift. The girls who came into her sewing room were eager and nervous. "Are you sure I can learn?" one asked. Lydia laughed gently. "If I learned with broken needles and second-hand thread, then you can learn with this." But beneath her progress lived one unanswered ache, Marissa. Some evenings, Lydia replayed old conversations, wondering where kindness ended and entitlement began. "Was I too soft?" she whispered one night. "Did I create a weakness?" Helen placed a cup of hot tea beside her. "You cannot erase greed with affection," Helen said. "And you cannot fix a heart that refuses to look inward." Lydia nodded, but grieving a living person is its own kind of exhaustion. Nearly a year after the hammer incident, a storm rolled across Harbor Point. Cold rain, low clouds, heavy winds. Lydia sat in her parlor near the fireplace, listening to raindrops strike the roof. She was halfway through knitting a scarf when her doorbell rang. She frowned. Few people arrived unannounced anymore. Lydia stood, wrapped herself in a cardigan, and opened the door. On the porch stood a young woman, maybe 20 years old, maybe younger. She had nervous eyes and rain-wet hair. "Mrs. Monroe?" she asked softly. Lydia nodded. "Yes. Can I help you?" The young woman swallowed hard. "My name is Ella Dunn. You're my grandmother." Lydia froze, breath caught in her throat. "Marissa's daughter?" Ella nodded. "She doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't want me to contact you." Lydia stepped aside without thinking. "Come in so you don't freeze." Ella stepped into the warm parlor, looking frightened and hopeful. Lydia guided her toward the fire. "Your mother kept you away," Lydia said gently, not as accusation, but as truth. Ella nodded. "She said you were dangerous. She said you might manipulate me." Lydia closed her eyes for a moment. "That isn't true." Ella exhaled shakily. "I didn't believe her. My dad, before he passed, told me stories about this house. He said it was a place built by two people who worked harder than anyone he knew." Lydia felt her throat tighten. "Your father was a decent man," she whispered. Ella's eyes brightened. "I want to know if those stories were real." Lydia studied her face. The same cheekbones Marissa had when she was a girl, the same spark that once made Lydia proud. She gestured toward the fireplace stones. "Your grandfather laid every one of those." Ella touched the stones like sacred objects. "So it's true," she whispered. They talked for hours. Lydia told Ella the real history, not about property value or inheritance, but about steel factory towns, second-hand thread, and a young carpenter who wanted better. Ella sat cross-legged on the rug, listening with wide eyes. "My mother said you tried to ruin her," Ella murmured. Lydia shook her head. "No. I tried to stop her from hurting herself. And from hurting me." Ella hesitated. "Do you hate her?" Lydia looked directly at the flames. "Hate is a heavy thing to carry. I prefer the weight of honesty." Ella swallowed. "Can you ever forgive her?" Lydia chose her words carefully. "Forgiveness is not a key that opens a door for someone else. It is a path you choose for yourself." "I'm still walking." Ella leaned closer to the fire. "I'm glad I came," she whispered. Lydia smiled faintly. "So am I." Days became weeks. Ella returned often, bringing fabric, ideas, and questions. She watched Lydia cut cloth and said, "You make it look easy." Lydia answered, "It wasn't easy. It was survival." Together, they designed simple skirts that Ella modeled shyly for the younger girls. Helen would stop by and shake her head. "You two are becoming troublemakers," she joked. Ella laughed, a sound Lydia cherished, because it reminded her of a childhood she thought was gone forever. One evening, Ella stood by the window watching the sunset bleed into the water. "Grandma," she said softly, "do you think Mom will ever change?" Lydia placed a hand over Ella's. People change only when they want to, and when they recognize the cost of staying the same. Ella nodded slowly. But what if she never does? Lydia exhaled. Then you build your own life with honesty. You don't inherit character. You grow it. Ella stared through the window glass. I want to be better than all this, she whispered. And Lydia knew a new chapter was forming. Not through force, but through example. Lydia understood something new as she watched Ella grow comfortable in the sewing room. Healing did not arrive like a sudden miracle. It arrived in small stitches, in quiet conversations, in the slow rebuilding of trust. Lydia found herself wondering whether Marissa felt any regret wherever she had gone. Helen would sometimes bring updates, rumors about Carter facing civil suits, talk that Marissa was living under another name, but Lydia never asked for more. Some knowledge is poison, Lydia told Helen. I do not need another dose. Still, at night, Lydia sometimes stared at the empty hallway and said quietly, I hope she is safe. Not happy, not rewarded, not triumphant. Just safe. Ellen noticed the lingering sadness. You still love her, she said one day. Lydia nodded. Love doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. Ella studied her grandmother's hands, the hands that once shook with fear, now steady with purpose. Is that why you kept the house? Ella asked. Lydia smiled gently. No. I kept the house because truth needs walls. It needs a place to stand. One windy afternoon, Lydia and Ella took a slow walk to the edge of the cliff behind the house. The Atlantic crashed against the rocks. The air smelled of salt and memory. Your grandfather loved this view, Lydia said. He called it proof that hard work can carve a home out of the wild. Ella wrapped her arms around herself. Were you ever scared, Grandma? Lydia chuckled. Every day. But fear doesn't stop you. It teaches you where to dig your heels. Ella hesitated. Mom said life didn't give her a fair chance. Lydia sighed. Many people confuse unfair with undeserved. Your mother wanted a shortcut to success. She forgot that shortcuts often lead nowhere. They stood in silence until Ella spoke again. I want to earn my life, not take it. Lydia nodded. That is how you survive disappointment. That is how you guard your future. The ocean wind felt like a cleansing hand, brushing away the last fragments of that awful night, metal against wood, shouting, broken trust. Winter came again. Lydia prepared the house for cold weather, sealing windows, stacking firewood, humming to herself. Ella helped her fold blankets. The sewing program expanded, more young women, more laughter, more confidence. Helen brought in a retired teacher to help. Lydia watched the girls flourish and thought, my legacy lives here. One evening, Ella said, Dad used to tell me that strength meant lifting heavy things. But I think maybe strength means saying no. Lydia nodded. Your father was a strong man, but you're learning a different kind of strength. Ella sat beside her. Do you want Mom to come back someday? Lydia breathed slowly. If she comes back because she wants healing, yes. If she comes back to take, no. Ella swallowed. How will you know the difference? Lydia smiled sadly. Eyes tell the truth long before mouths do. The fire crackled between them. Lydia felt something unexpected, peace. Not because everything was repaired, but because she had finally stopped bleeding. By spring, Lydia had accepted an unspoken truth. Closure does not erase scars. It simply teaches you to live with them. One morning, she stood in the garden pruning roses, careful not to break the stems. Helen came by with legal papers confirming the final conviction against Carter. He won't trouble you again, Helen said. Lydia nodded. Consequences always arrive. Maybe late, but they arrive. Helen studied her friend's expression. Do you want revenge? Lydia shook her head. Revenge is a fire that burns the wrong home. Instead, she planted new roses. Deep red ones. Ella walked outside and touched a new bud. Grandma, do thorns bother you? Lydia smiled. Thorns protect beauty. Pain protects wisdom. You learn to handle both. Ella nodded slowly, understanding more than she said aloud. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Lydia sat by the fireplace again, this time not hiding or strategizing, simply resting. Ella placed a new notebook in her lap. "Write your story," Ella said. "Other women need to hear it." Lydia laughed softly. "Who would care?" Ella answered firmly, "Women who think silence is survival. Women who think age makes them powerless." Lydia opened the notebook. "I never planned to be anyone's lesson." Ella shook her head. "You became one anyway." Lydia began writing, about thread and wood, about marriage and struggle, about betrayal and resistance. She wrote about the night of the hammer, the moment police stepped inside, the expression on Marissa's face when truth arrived. She wrote about letting go. Words poured out of her like water she'd been storing for years. When she finished the first page, she exhaled. "Maybe this is where forgiveness begins," she whispered. Summer returned. Lydia turned 68. Her sewing foundation held a small celebration in her honor. The young women presented a quilt stitched with their names. Lydia's eyes softened. "Frank would have been proud," she said. Helen raised a glass of iced tea. "You kept your dignity. That is worth more than property." Ella hugged her grandmother gently. Lydia whispered, "You are my second chance." Ella smiled. "And you are mine." Lydia looked at the sunlight reflecting on the water outside. It struck her that peace doesn't come from winning battles. It comes from choosing which battles matter. She chose the battle for her mind. She chose the battle for her home. She chose the battle for honesty. And she had won all three. Late one evening, Lydia sat on the back steps as the sky darkened to violet. She listened to the waves crash against the cliff. Ella sat beside her. "What now, Grandma?" Lydia inhaled deeply. "Now we build forward, not backward." Ella nodded. "Do you think Mom will ever want to speak to us?" Lydia stared toward the dark ocean. "Maybe. Maybe not. But forgiveness isn't an invitation. It's a decision. I forgive her enough to let her live her life. I forgive myself enough to live mine." Ella rested her head on Lydia's shoulder. Lydia placed an arm around her. "Character is forged in adversity," she said. "And dignity is the foundation no hammer can break." The wind rustled Lydia's hair, gentle and cool. She felt Frank there, not in grief, but in strength. She looked at Ella and saw a future stitched with better thread. And as night wrapped the house she defended, Lydia Monroe finally felt free, calm, steady, and wholly unbroken. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.